Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. Now a few videos back I showed you my new to me team slot Renault Alpine A110 and I told you about my original model about way back when I used to race rally and how it was a good race car after a lot of tweaking because the basic car was a bit of a heap, to be honest. So my new car is the same. It's a survivor of 20 odd years. No one's ever touched this car and it has all the same problems as my original car did way back in the 90s. So I asked you the question, should I take this car and make it really nice to drive, or should I leave it as a survivor time capsule that no one's messed about with to date? And overwhelmingly in the comments below you said, Rob, do your thing, make it the car it always should be. So I've listened to you. I'm going to do it and I've got the parts to do it. So what we'll do is we'll get this car on Crow Valley and we'll see what sort of lap it will do in 7 laps. Now, as I said before, 55 seconds is a good time. 50 seconds is a really good time. Anything faster than 50 seconds is flying and where you need to be for a competition car. So we're going to get this car on the track and I'm going to see what it'll do. Now, I'm not expecting great things. It's not going to return great things, but I'm going to see if I can capture some of the hop as well. And we'll put in 7 laps and we'll see where we are. And I think I'm probably going to be somewhere around 62 seconds, I suspect. Because it's going to be so hoppy and jumpy, we're going to really struggle to break the 50 seconds, I'm sure. It'll be 60 something. But let's get her on the track and we'll find out right now. Now, I don't normally swear on camera, but oh my God, that was truly awful. As the grip level came up in the track, the car got worse and worse. It was all I could do to keep the back end down. It was jumping around like some demented jumping bean. Crazy. Anyway, the time that you saw was the best I could get. That was it. And I struggled to get it in the 60s. I couldn't believe the first time I did it was 72 something. I thought, I got to get it into the 60s. And the next one was 70 point something. And it was like, it was on the edge all the time, just in the air more than it was on the track. Anyway, I managed to squeeze in that 69.2, which is about as good as it's going to get. So we got all this lot to go in there. And hopefully we'll make it better. So I'm going to get you on my bench and we'll go through what I got here and how I'm going to go about putting it in this car. So first up, of the most needed parts are these Staff's wheels. These are 15.8 by 8.5, and I had to get the grey ones because the silver ones that I actually wanted are out of stock. But it's 8.5 front and rear to match the original car, and I'll have to just polish those rims back just to get that chrome look. I'll leave the rest dark because it looks quite good, and you won't see it when it's actually on the car, only the actual very edge of the rim. So those will be a good start, the most needed start I would say, to stop the car from jumping. So next up, out of my spares box, is this small pile of parts. Now these tyres are what they would call scrubs if you were drifting, but they're slotted G25 rear tyres, very lightly used, but they're still perfectly good and they'll be great for this car. Now the actual grip of the original tyres isn't actually all that bad. It's probably what's contributing to the jumping all over the place. There's so much grip, the grip is taking over the egg tyres and making it jump. So really, if it had slightly less grippy rear tyres, it would probably be a little bit easier to drive. But we're going to do it anyway. So slotted G25 tyres, partially used, they'll be really good. And I did say that there was nothing wrong with the guide on the car, and there isn't. But as soon as we're going this far, we may as well fit a really nice guide on it. So there's a Slotting Plus guide there at 7mm deep. The original guide is only 6mm deep, so this is a millimetre deeper. So it is actually an upgrade, so it is worth doing. And then we've got a pair of body mounting screws, and these are the type with those clean shoulders on, so it'll give us a little bit of body float. I didn't want to go too mad with over the top customization, but while we're here, so the next up we're going to do is some lead. So I sell this lead in little packets here at a reasonable price, so we're going to fit a little bit of lead down the side of the chassis, so that's going to help as well. So next up, we're going to replace that terrible rear gear with something a lot nicer. Now the original gear is far too tight and it's got tight spots in it. And the trouble with a gear that's so tight is every time you give it power, it can't spin up the motor quick enough, so you get this delay. And then you get the power coming in really hard because suddenly the motor takes off, and that makes problems worse. It's very hard to drive it smoothly with a terrible gear that's tight and tight spots. So we've got this really nice slotted 27 tooth crown gear in the brass configuration, and this is a direct replacement 27 tooth for the gear that comes in the car. So that's going to really help as well. And of course we're going to need some decent axles to go with our decent wheels and a decent gear, and that is a slotted 2.38 standard axle in 48mm long. This will need trimming, I'm sure, but that'll really do the job as well, and we can guarantee that these are nice and straight. So last but not least, we're going to need bearings. The bearings in the original car are bigger than 2.38, so we can't use those anyway. So we're going to have to get some new bearings for these nice new axles and wheels and everything else. So we've got these SRC bearings, and these are actually asymmetrical. But the reason I got these is because they were the cheapest that Pendle Slot had to sell, and there's a pack of 4. So I think these cost me about £4.50 for 4, as opposed to the slotted gears that are about £4.50 for just 2. So these were half the price. So I don't mind them being slightly weird. They'll be fine. I'll make them fit. They'll be absolutely fine. And at half the price, I'm going with it. So with that lot explained, let's get these parts on my workbench and fitted into this car. Okay, so first we're going to look at the car on the setup plate and look at the relationship between the front wheel and the ground and the arch when the car is at rest, because that will be important when we get to fitting the guide back on. And because we're going to be messing around with this front axle and its bearing, we need to know where we're starting from. So we can see that it's actually very good. If anything, the front wheel is a little bit forwards in the arch, so if we can, we'll try and move the wheel slightly backwards, but the actual resting position is very good, so that's worthy of note. So let's get this body off, and then we'll get that back axle out and start working on those bearings. Okay, so with the back axle out the car completely, we can now measure these bearings where they seat in the plastic and see what their diameter is, and it says 4.86. so let's see what our new bearings actually are, because these aren't obviously the correct bearings for the car, so who knows what we've got. Okay, so 4.86. in fact, if we zero it off there, settle it down. Right, there we are, and then we can see, hopefully we're not too far away. There we are. We're 0.14 of a millimetre bigger, which is fine. So if we convert that to thousandths of an inch, which I'm slightly more familiar with really. So if we zero them again, there we are about 6 thousandths of an inch, which really isn't very much, but it's something. So what we'll need to do is we need to open up these bearings very, very slightly, because I know that these are a decent fit in that chassis. So they're going to be a little bit too tight when we're fitting in something a little bit larger diameter. So the fit is like that. They're not too bad actually. They're not too slack. They're not too tight. But I'd like to open them up anyway to get a decent fit. So the way I'm going to do that is I measure, put it back to 0, put it back to metric, because all my drill set, I've got a very large set of drills here that goes up in 0.1 of a mil right up to 6 mil. So I've got some good variation on my drill sizes. So if I measure this now, that's saying that it's basically 5 mil. It's basically 5 mil. So I have a 5 mil drill here, and that is just a shade under 5 mil, because these twist drills always drill oversize. So although it's a 5 mil drill, it will actually over drill, and the shanks are usually a hair smaller anyway. So this is 4.97. So I'm going to use this as a gauge to go in there, and so that won't go in there. That's really, well, yeah, it's really, really tight. So I'll take my rat tail file, which is actually a hair over 5 mil, and it's tapered. So if I put my file in that hole and then back file it, so it's working against the file, almost like a drill but not quite, and then we'll see what we've got. There we are. Look, straight in there, no problems at all. Do exactly the same on the other side. Just back file it, don't take it too deep, and there you are. Perfect. So there we are. That's 100%. So next we need to work out what our gap is on the bearing, and the gap on the bearing is roughly basically 2.1. So I've actually got a 2.1 mil drill in my drill set, so I'll put that on back, get a 2.1, which is this one here, and we can double check that measurement by putting that in there. And as you can see, it actually holds it in the bearing. So, and it's not too tight a fit by doing that. So we know that that is actually 2.1 mil. So if we measure the thickness of the plastic here, we can see that that is 2.19. So, or 2.22 on the other side, more or less the same. So we're looking at about 0.1 of a mil too thick. So I suspect that will be a little bit too tight. So what we'll do is we'll just shave away just a hair of that plastic in there. Not too much, you don't need to go mad. Just to take away some of that nip in there. So we get away that bit there. And take away that little tiny bit in there. That should be enough. So we'll have a look what we got now. There we are, 2.208 and 2.09. That one again, 2.1, 2.09. So that's going to be pretty close. Now, as I said before, these bearings are actually asymmetrical. So we've got a thin shoulder on this side and a thicker shoulder on that side. So we need to check to see what we're looking at now, and what we'll do is we'll measure this bearing here. So there we are. Actually, let's turn it down to 1000 because it's easier. Right, let's clean the jaws. Yeah, that's zeroed. So we'll measure that there. So that's 30, call it 35 thou, and the thicker part of this bearing is, there you go, 33.4, 33 thou. So basically the outer shoulder, it's the same thickness as the outer shoulder on this bearing here, so we know we're safe. We can just pop the bearing in and it won't actually make any difference at all. So there we are, he goes in. Grab another one for fun, chuck him in, and we should be done on the bearings. There we are. Right, so that's it, the bearings are in. Our non-Team Slot bearings, SRC bearings in fact, are now in our car, and we know they're fitting and they went in lovely. They felt great. So now we can test that with our axle and see if the axle is still nice and free to turn in those bearings. And at the moment they're not. So what we need to do is seat those bearings and make those bearings fit nicely. So it's just a case of in and out and wiggling around, just settling them in, taking them out, just getting them seated down in the holder, and then we'll take it from there and see if we can get the whole thing to spin nice and freely. So there we are. There we are, that's a lot better already. So we just give them a little bit of a wiggle around again until, because these bearings are so much better than the original bearings in the axle, the alignment is quite critical. So there we are, that's getting pretty good. A bit more maneuvering around, pull him out again. There we are, not terrible, needs a bit of work, but it's okay. So what we can do in fact is just trim the inside again, just make that a little bit slacker again on the inside. Oh, that's much better. Let's do the same on the other side. We're just thinning these bearings, these bearing posts down just a hair. There, a little tiny bit of material away. Click them in place. There we are, that's a lot better. There you go, perfect. That's a really nice fit now. There's nothing wrong with that. That'll bed in very nicely. There we are. It almost falls out, to be fair. Oh yeah, there we are. There we are, you can put it in there and it will actually drop out under its own weight. So that's it. So that's our axle, perfectly aligned and ready to go. Now I'm going to put a spot of glue while the bearings are in exactly where we want them to be. I'm going to put a spot of glue on the top of the bearings to lock them into place, and that's our bearings finished. So next we've got to fit our gear. So let's see how our gear fits on our new setup. Like that. Right, now I can tell you that that is absolutely fine. There's a very small amount of backlash at that point there. I don't know if you can tell, maybe not side to side, but backlash. Turn it 90 degrees. Yeah, so I wonder if I could, no. If I put the gears, the grub screw there, you can see, hopefully, that there's a very small amount of backlash there. Then if I turn it 90 degrees, you can, hopefully you'll see that there's backlash there. If I turn it 90 degrees here, you can see there's hopefully, I can feel it anyway. If I turn it here, you might be able to see through there, maybe. There's definitely backlash there as well. So if you can't see it, I know it's there. There's definitely a good amount of backlash there. That's not a problem at all. So we're good to go on the gear. And that's the gear done. We'll pop a grub screw in there and it's finished. Which goes to tell me that because this pinion was tight in this gear, but this pinion is great in this gear, this pinion is either a happy match for this slotted pinion, or this original gear, Team Slot gear, is just not correctly made. It's too thick for this particular motor and pinion, or possibly this groove here is a bit too narrow and it's forcing the pinion over or whatever. But whatever way it goes round, that pinion there is very nice. If it wasn't, I would just change the pinion for a slotted pinion, and that would be good, because then the two types of teeth would mesh together correctly. But as it stands, it's all good. We don't need to change the pinion. We're good to go. So let's move on to getting these wheels sorted out. Now actually, just before we move on to the wheels, I've got a bit of an issue with this motor. Now, I don't know if you can tell in the camera, but there's quite a large gap between the end of the motor shaft and the back of that gear. Now that wouldn't be a problem if this motor shaft was really nice and it was having a positive engagement into that side of that groove. But if I pop this motor out carefully, hopefully you can see that that is probably the worst end of a motor that you're ever likely to see, and I hope that this camera is going to pick this up. But the end of that motor is absolutely terrible. I'm hoping that this camera is picking this up, but it's absolutely awful. I've never seen anything quite as bad as that, and it is engaging in that brass gear, but it'll be all right for what we're doing for a few laps to test the theory of the car and to make the car better. But if I was going to use this car for any prolonged period of time, I would definitely have to change that motor, because that shaft could do with being longer, but the end of that shaft is going to really hurt this gear over time, and that's a silly thing to do with a brand new gear. So we're going to leave this motor for now, purely because it's got team slot on the bottom of it. That's the only reason. And we'll possibly change it for something better later on down the line. I don't know, but it'll be all right for now. It'll get the job done, and I might think about changing it off camera later on, who knows, but we'll see. Anyway, let's get these wheels in the lathe and polish off the front faces so they all look nice and shiny from the front. Okay, so with that done, with all the anodizing removed from the parts that we're actually going to see of the wheels, we now need to turn our attentions to liberating the middle of these wheels. Now, this is where we run into a little bit of a problem, and I'm going to give you a little lesson on lathe chucks in case you don't know. So if you do know, just hold tight and we'll get on to something more interesting in a minute. But basically, as you can see, hopefully you can see, this side of the wheel is massively off center. Now, obviously, the wheel revolves around the axle, and the whole wheel isn't mounted correctly on this axle. It's actually moving up and down. So if I was to take this axle and put it straight into my lathe and just machine the wheel, I'd end up with an off-center of the wheel. I'm going to lose my detail because the wheel is wobbling up and down. So I need to be able to revolve this wheel off-center so that the actual center of the wheel is in center. So normally what we have on a lathe is what we call a self-centering 3-jaw chuck. So all those jaws center automatically, more or less. I mean, in terms of thousandths of an inch is a few thou out. They're never regarded as being massively precise, but for what we do, they're precise enough. So that's your self-centering 3-jaw chuck. And if I was to put this axle in there, the wheel would be off center. Now also we have a 4-jaw self-centering chuck for square section and so on. Exactly the same as a 3-jaw, just with an extra jaw. But we also have a independent 4-jaw chuck. And the way this works is that, as it states, every jaw is independent. So what I intend to do is I intend to use this 4-jaw self-centering chuck to get my off-center wheels center. So I'm going to disregard this gear because it's no good to me, and the bearings, they're oversized. The axles are non-standard, who knows if they're straight. So I'm going to take off this gear, and I'm going to take off these bearings. I'm going to cut the axle straight in half, and I'm going to use the axle as a mandrel to go in my independent 4-jaw chuck, and what I can do is I can adjust these jaws to move the wheel up and down and left and right to get the center of that wheel running true. So I'm going to put my cutter up to the edge of that rim, and I'm going to revolve the wheel by hand and adjust these jaws one by one individually, so I actually get the wheel to run dead center regardless of what the axle is doing. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to get the gear off, cut these 2 axles in half, pop them in the jaw, center them up individually, and then I'm going to machine back the whole of the outside of the wheel until it's a perfect fit into the center of my Staff's wheel. And then once I've got that, I'll come in and I'll part off the face with a parting tool, and that means that I'll be able to liberate that wheel detail and we can move on to the next stage. So off we go. And there they all are, finished. So what I found, by trimming the back of the wheel as close as I dare to the back of the spoke, but leaving the full depth of the front of the wheel, by inserting it in, they almost kind of fit. But I'm 65 thousandths of an inch, a little bit too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop these wheels back in the lathe and just take 65 thou off of that center spigot there, and that should allow the center hubs to go in perfectly and go flush with the wheel and look exactly like they did on the original car. So back on the lathe. So there we are. So that's 65 thou taken off this inside rim, which will allow us to sink these wheel centers all the way down, and it hasn't compromised the width of the boss back here. There's still plenty of meat to get that axle on, and you can see by putting it on the independent 4-jaw, the rim of this wheel is absolutely perfectly round because I was able to square it all up before I took a cut. So these are absolutely perfect. So what I've got to do now, put a bit of glue on this bit of waste plastic, put a little bit of glue around the inside edge of this wheel, and then pop all these centers in. And there it is, all done. So if we pop a tyre on, you'll see that it should look exactly like it used to. There you go, all done, just like the original wheel. Right, let's get these wheels on this car. So that was an amazing piece of luck. I thought that these axles are going to be a little bit too long, but as it happens, they're absolutely the perfect length. Not a single bit of tyre sticks out from the arch, and it doesn't sink in any more than the actual wheel arch edge. So that's 100% perfect by pure luck. I was fully expecting to have to chop the axle down. Anyway, right, moving on. I now need to strip all of this back out again, actually, leaving the bearings in, because I need to put the bearings in the front end, and I want to be able to get to the back bearings as a reference to where the front ones have got to go. So I take out the motor, guide, back axle, trim off these silly little wings on here, and then file a slot or a hole in the front of these axle holders so that I can get the new bearings in the front using the back bearings as a register. So let's crack on with that. And there we are. So after a little bit of fiddling around with a file, we got those 2 mounts all cut away to accept our bearings. So if we drop the bearings into the new mounts, they will clip in just like that. A nice reassuring click. I'll pop some wheels on there and we can see that they all fit exactly as they should do. And we can see there's a nice even gap across the bottom of the chassis. It's beautifully free to roll, and there is no rock in either corner. It's nice and level and exactly where it should be. And also just double checking the front width of the front axle. Again, is perfect. That's luck. That is pure luck. I thought I was going to have to chop these axles down, but I don't have to, so that's great. Right, so now what you can see is we've got a whole load of side float here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure, I'm going to measure that width, that total width there, half it, and then make 2 brass spacers to go either side to get that front wheel, or the front axle, exactly in the right place. So let's crack on the lathe and get a pair of spacers made. So there they are, the 2 front spacers to keep the front end where it should be. They're 255 thou a piece, and we'll just whiz them through with a 332 reamer just to make sure that they're exactly the right diameter. I'm not going to flap around, and then we can mount them on the axle. I've already put tyres on these front wheels, and I've also glued in the front bearings as well, exactly the same as the rear, just to save a bit of time, and they can go all the way home. You hear a nice snap there, and you can see that there's just a little tiny bit of end float, very, very minimal, and these wheels are fully pushed in together. So give it a little nip, and a little nip. There we are, and we just pop a spot of oil on that front bearing, there, and there we have it. Look at that. No problems at all. And there's a little tiny bit of end float, but not much. And also it fits the front wheel arches perfectly. So that, and I've already glued in the motor as well, because the motor was a little bit wobbly, so I've glued the motor in and I've greased up the back end as well. So that basically brings us to the end of getting it back onto all 4 wheels. So now we just got to think about popping the guide in, which is just a simple case of getting the Slotting Plus guide, making sure that it fits nicely by just giving a little bit of trimming to the bottom of it, putting a couple of shims underneath just to bring it down to the correct level so that the front tyres just about miss, braiding it up, and we're good to go. I run that all in fast forward because that's nothing that hasn't already been seen before, and then we can pop it on the track and see what she'll do again. Okay, so that's the front guide in and centering really, really nicely. And when you put it on the setup plate, move the back wheels, the fronts do turn, but they're very, very easy to turn by hand. So the height of that guide has been set correctly. We've also got 7 grams of weight in total in the back end with a slight bias to the rear. So it's 2 pieces of lead there. And the last job to do is to fit these body float screws. Now the problem with these body float screws is really you need to have some body clearance all the way around so everything can move. But as you can see, the plastic on here is very thin, and I don't really want to be butchering this car too much. I mean, I've already done a reasonable amount to it anyway, but pulling off all this plastic on the side, which you would do for competition, just seems a little bit more than I'm willing to do on a car that's not actually going to go into competition. It's just supposed to be a car that I can enjoy and run, and it will run nicely. So having fitted the body on previously, I've discovered that it is a little bit tight. It's not tight, but it's just not how you would have it as if it was a competition car. If it was a competition car, you would take away this thin plastic here and that would give you a really nice clearance. But I think where we're at with it, it will be enough. It will move, there will be a little bit of movement there, and that will be enough, I think. So we'll pop the screws in as they are now, and I'll show you how much float we got with the body screws in. There we are. So there's a little bit of float there. It looks like it's quite a lot on camera, I guess. A little tiny bit of up and down, but in reality it's a little bit stiff. It's not too bad. I've seen a lot worse. It certainly does move quite nicely, but if I was doing a competition car, I'd take a little bit more off the side and a little bit off the back here, just to ease that movement so it's nice and free. But at the moment that's not really restricting the chassis, and that's really all you want, and hopefully it'll return a half decent time now. So let's try it on the track. There we are. I asked you and you asked for it. War and peace on my little Team Slot Alpine. Now, I've got to admit, a few laps in after tuning it, the end of that original motor did start chewing the gear, so I had to change the motor for one of George's Predator motors that he sent me his little care package the other week. Picture here. So after that motor went in, this car turned into a fire-breathing monster. It was a little bit of a handful, to be fair, but I managed to get it round the track and make good with that motor. So I guess you're wondering how fast it actually went after all the modifications. Well, I can tell you up front that it ran a hell of a lot smoother. It ran like a normal car, an absolute joy to drive, but a little bit challenging, I guess. So here is the time. And there you go. I really did try and get it in the 50s. I really did try. Thing is, I don't want to, because this isn't going to be a racing car. It's just a historical car for me to put on the shelf and to reminisce about days gone by. I didn't want to break it. I didn't want to push it. It could do with a Lexan interior. It could do with a bit more lightning. It could do with a little bit of trimming around the sills to get a bit more body float. It could do with a couple of extra things if you were going to race it properly. But we're not back 20 years ago. We're here now, where the Porsche 914 is dominant in the classic class, and my Renault A310 is very good as well. To be honest with you, getting this car round the track in 51 seconds as it is right now was quite a handful. It really did. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe on a different day I'd be able to do it. Maybe it needs a little bit more tuning. But what's the point, really? I mean, it's not going to be a competitive car these days, and it ran really well now. So compared to what it was 24 hours ago, compared to what it is now, it's a totally different car. It's very smooth, very drivable, and very quick. And with a little bit of extra tuning, it could well be quicker. If you take the fastest lap of 7.1, times that by 7, you get 49.7, I think, laps. So that's inside the quicker than the 50-second mark. So the car absolutely does have a sub 50-second in it. So it just needs a little bit more tuning, and maybe someone with a little bit less sleep deprivation, that would probably do it. But it would be pushing it really hard, I think. So it is what it is. I really like it. So and I hope you've really liked it, and I did try and give as much information in this video as I could, make it more of a sort of a learning video for people that don't know. Obviously you guys that do know, boy, you're silly, you've probably turned off by now, but you know, I try and help the guys that don't know so much. So, and I hope I've done that. So if you've enjoyed this content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much. Washing machines live longer with cow dung.